Hi, I'm Nell Duke. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in Literacy, Language, and Culture and in the combined program in Education and Psychology. My work focuses on early literacy development, particularly among children living in poverty. Today I'm here to talk with you about speaking up for science and social studies education. There's been an enormous decline in the United States in science and social studies education at the elementary level. At least since No Child Left Behind, and arguably before that, U.S. elementary schools have been spending more time on English language arts, more time on math, less time on science, and less time on social studies. These changes don't appear to be randomly distributed. Rather, it's children of poverty who are more likely to spend more time on math and on English language arts, and relatively less time on science and on social studies. This is problematic. If we think about what this means long term, it means that our citizens who are budding citizens, who are of lower socioeconomic status, are getting less opportunity to learn about things like how our government works, to learn about environmental science, to be able to process the kinds of information that one needs to recognize the environmental racism that occurs in our country. There is a stratification going on when we allow some children in our society to learn much more about science and social studies than we enable other children in our society to learn. We need to do something about the situation. This decline in time spent on science and social studies education at the elementary level in the United States is going to be detrimental to science learning. We can assume that if less curricular time is devoted to science in the elementary grades, kids are going to have lower science achievement than they would. And in fact, there is some data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, for example, that sees a relationship between the amount of time that's reported to be spent on science education and students' science achievement. We can make the same assumption about social studies. Kids will leave elementary school in the U.S. knowing less about social studies, having fewer social studies process skills if they have spent their elementary career almost exclusively on English language arts and math to the exclusion of science and social studies. But I'm arguing that this decline of attention to science and social studies is also detrimental to literacy learning. That is, that literacy actually requires, in the long term, strong understanding, knowledge of the world. It requires students to know the things that authors assume they know. And so if we don't have that in place, we don't have all that vocabulary knowledge that goes with it in that place, if we haven't developed students' ability to read and write inside science and social studies disciplines, then we're actually going to have long-term pain. So it may seem like in the short term, we're going to raise literacy and math achievement by spending so much time on literacy and math, but in the long term, we're going to pay for the system that we've developed. So I'm a literacy scholar. My focus is on helping U.S. kids learn reading, writing, and other literacy skills, and I am asking the field to devote more time to science and social studies education at the elementary level. I'm going to offer 3 reasons why I'm making this plea, even as a literacy scholar. The first is that science and social studies knowledge, as I've already suggested, significantly affect reading and writing. The second is that science and social studies actually provide a very compelling context for literacy education. And the third argument I'm going to make is that reading and writing and other literacy practices are actually an integral part of the practice of science and social studies. And therefore, they're as much the clients of literacy education as they are benefiting from it. I would like to use this thought experiment to begin the first point. So if you would just read this passage and try to comprehend it. My guess is that most of you anyway, had difficulty comprehending this passage. It wasn't that you couldn't read the words that are in the passage fluently, but rather that overall you couldn't construct much meaning with this passage. This is because the passage is about cricket. And I'm told if you know about cricket, then this is an easy passage to understand. But if you don't know about cricket, it's a difficult passage to understand. And it's just a sort of proof of concept that, in fact, if you lack relevant knowledge related to what you're reading, it can be very difficult to comprehend it. That is, comprehension depends in part on your knowledge related to the text. Now, this supports, in one way, this point that science and social studies knowledge actually affects reading and writing achievement. And there are many, many studies that suggest that this is in fact the case. One that's often cited, I've been citing it for years, is the Recht and Leslie study. And in this study, they put together a sample of students who were either good readers or poor readers as measured by a typical norm reference standardized test of reading achievement. Some of the students in this sample were students who knew quite a lot about baseball, and others were students who didn't know much about baseball. And they made sure that the knowledge was distributed across each of the groups, good and poor readers. So you had good readers who knew a lot about baseball, you had good readers who didn't know a lot about baseball, poor readers who knew a lot about baseball, and poor readers who did not know a lot about baseball. Then all of the students were asked to read a passage that described about half an inning of a baseball game. And they had a measure of their comprehension of that passage. It involved reenacting and also describing what they had just read. What they found in this study was that the poor readers, based on that norm reference standardized test of reading achievement, the poor readers who knew a lot about baseball actually had higher comprehension than the good readers who knew very little about baseball. What this study suggests is simply the power of world knowledge, that it's so powerful that it even rivaled, in this case, just general reading achievement in terms of affecting the comprehension of a passage. Now, this is one study, but there are really many others. For example, Priebe, Miller, and Keenan have a study that has very similar findings that was done much more recently. And there's also lots of research that shows in different ways the ways in which how much world knowledge you have predicts long-term reading achievement. So there's lots of reason to think that reading comprehension is highly affected by one's world knowledge. Although there's less research in writing, there's also some there that suggests that topic knowledge, how much you know about the topic you're writing about, has an impact on the quality of that writing. So even in the domain of writing, we can make an argument that science and social studies knowledge is important to literacy achievement. There are a number of reasons why we think that knowledge related to a passage is so influential on reading achievement, and I'm going to share some of those with you. So one way that knowledge is really helpful is in terms of processing vocabulary. So you can just handle vocabulary that you encounter when you have more conceptual knowledge, and of course you know more of the vocabulary. And thinking back to the example I gave with the cricket match, you can imagine that if you knew all of that information about cricket, and in particular if you knew those vocabulary words, the passage would have been easier for you to understand. We also have some evidence to suggest that more world knowledge actually allows you to handle new vocabulary better. So even if you don't know the words in the passage or in what you're reading, if you have high background knowledge, high knowledge relative to what you're reading, you'll be able to manage the new vocabulary you encounter more effectively. There's also evidence that inference generation, the sort of reading between the lines that we all have to do in order to comprehend, goes better when we have more relevant prior knowledge. We also have some indication that the ability to handle incoherence in text, or to handle texts that are not as well written as we would like, is stronger when we have more relevant background knowledge. And finally, the whole process of comprehension, for example, in Kinch's model, in which we create a text space and then a situation model when we are, or along with a situation model while we're comprehending, that process is facilitated by stronger relevant world knowledge relevant to the passage at hand. So I've talked about why reading comprehension and even writing are highly affected by the world knowledge that you possess, and in particular knowledge in science and social studies. A second reason why, as a literacy scholar, I'm asking for more attention to science and social studies in the elementary grades is that science and social studies provide a really compelling context for reading and writing education, for literacy education. So I'm going to turn to that argument next. One study I like to cite is the Galtney 1995 study. In this study, they were working with 4th and 5th graders who were relatively poor readers based, again, on a general assessment. And they ensured that all the students in the sample had strong knowledge of baseball. Not sure why we've got so many sports foci, but anyway, so strong baseball knowledge. The students were going to be instructed in asking why questions. And for those of you who don't know, there's considerable evidence dating back a long time that getting students to ask why as they read is helpful to improving their comprehension. So this is a good strategy to teach students to use. So they provided this why question asking strategy instruction in two different contexts. For some of the students, they did it with texts about baseball, and for other students, they did it with texts that were not about baseball. You can probably guess where this is going. Those students who were taught the why question asking strategy inside the context of the text about baseball actually learned the strategy better. That is, they learned the strategy better when there was rich knowledge related to the, they had rich knowledge related to the text that they were reading. More importantly, when you gave them a brand new text that wasn't actually about baseball, you found that they had higher comprehension than the group who had learned the why question strategy outside of texts that were of high background knowledge for them. So this just suggests that, at least in the context of teaching this why question strategy, it's helpful to do it in the context of an area in which students have rich knowledge. So you can imagine that if you have a science unit or a social studies unit in which students develop in-depth knowledge of a particular topic within that domain, that would be a good place in which to teach comprehension strategies such as the asking why questions strategy. Science and social studies provide a compelling context for teaching reading and writing, not just in the narrow sense of an individual strategy like asking why questions, but more broadly as well. So here I'm drawing on part of a very long line of research on something called concept-oriented reading instruction, or CORI. In concept-oriented reading instruction, what happens is that comprehension strategy instruction, other reading language arts type instruction is actually embedded in a focus on a conceptual theme in science, and in more recent work in social studies as well. So a conceptual theme in science drives what students are doing, and in that context, the students are learning important strategies, doing lots of volume reading, doing some writing as well. So in this particular study of the concept-oriented reading instruction approach, they compared concept-oriented reading instruction on a particular, again, science theme or concept to just plain old strategy instruction like you might typically find in an English language arts block, so not really embedded in a deep knowledge base or topic within science or social studies. And there was also a control condition. That condition didn't get any instruction at all that was new or different. And what they found, again, you could probably predict this at this point in the talk, is that the concept-oriented reading instruction group, where the strategies were embedded in science, did better than the strategy instruction group, the group that learned their strategy instruction just in a regular English language arts context and not in a rich content context. However, that group, I should note, did better than a control group. So the strategy instruction was better than nothing at all, but it was even better when it was in the context of the concept-oriented reading instruction approach, which situates the instruction in science. I can also make a similar argument with social studies, although there's much less research in this area to date. But for example, in a study called Project Place, a project approach to literacy and civic engagement, which was conducted with my collaborator Annalisa Halverson and several other collaborators. In this project, what we did was embed informational text reading and writing instruction in the context of social studies. So the part of the day that teachers were devoting to social studies, not only focused on social studies units that we had written, project-based units, but also within those there was work on informational text reading and writing in the service of the social studies projects. What we found is that compared to a control condition, students in the Project Place classroom, so the students who had informational text reading and writing embedded in social studies education, had a 63% gain over the control group in social studies. That's probably not terribly surprising to you because we had these very carefully constructed project-based social studies units as compared to a sort of business as usual social studies education in the other classrooms. Although we did require that they actually teach social studies so that we would be comparing social studies to social studies. Anyway, 63% gain in social studies. but importantly, also a 23% gain compared to the control group in informational reading. So what that tells us is that we were able to foster informational reading development in the context of social studies education. We also got gains in informational writing for those classrooms in which teachers actually implemented lessons more consistently with our intent, or more like the way that those lessons were written. We didn't get an overall effect in this case because we did have, we think it's because we had some classrooms that didn't implement the lessons as much as intended. But for those who did, we also saw gains in informational writing. So again, we have some evidence to suggest that both science and social studies can provide a rich context for learning what we would traditionally think of as English language arts and literacy skills. So I've talked about two of the reasons now why I think it's so important as a literacy scholar that we devote more time to science and social studies at the elementary level. I'm going to talk now briefly about the third reason. The third reason is that reading and writing and other literacy practices are actually part and parcel of science and social studies. So let's talk a little bit more about that. When we look at the work of professionals, when you reflect on the work of professionals within these domains, whether we're talking about chemists or biologists or geologists or astronomers, economists, geographers, historians, politicians, and even just any political activist or anyone who's engaged in citizen science, you recognize that a lot of what they're doing involves reading and writing, right? Reading and writing and other literacy practices are just a part of the work of science and of social studies. And so as literacy educators, we're actually providing an incomplete literacy education if we're not teaching how to engage in reading and writing and other literacy practices in the context of science and social studies. In other words, that's part of our job as literacy educators and in literacy education. So to sum up, I have suggested that there are three really important reasons why we need to speak up for science and social studies at the elementary level, even those of us whose primary concern in life is English language arts or literacy. One reason, science and social studies knowledge definitely affect reading and writing achievement. A second, that science and social studies provide a compelling context for teaching reading and writing. And a third, that reading and writing and other literacy practices are actually part and parcel of the doing of science and social studies in our society. So what are the implications of the argument that I've just made? One implication is that we need to start in districts and schools all across America, and as needed even at the state level, developing model elementary school schedules that include considerable time for science and social studies every day. I have been suggesting 45 minutes a day for science and 45 minutes a day for social studies. Clearly, we don't have the research base to yet definitively say exactly what the right mix is, but we're talking here about considerably more time than is currently being devoted to these domains. A second thing we need to do is to make sure that model schedules become actual schedules. So as many of you, I'm sure, recognize, the schedule that we put on the classroom wall or the schedule that we publicize to parents and other families in our community is not always the schedule that actually happens in classrooms. So we need to be thinking carefully about making sure that science and social studies aren't the disciplines that always get, or the domains that always get the short end of the stick. And that is something that I often see happening. I'll even have educators tell me, well, we teach science or social studies, that's most common. We teach science or social studies every day. I'll say, oh, that's great, you teach it every day. And then they'll say, oh, well, but not on Mondays. And also every other Friday we don't do it. And any day we have double assembly, and I can't do it on Thursdays because I have double specials. So then by the time that you kind of do out the math, what it is that maybe on average, every other day, they teach science or social studies. And of course, when you look at what that adds up to over a 180-day school year, it's just not enough. Another thing we need to do is to stop pulling students out of science and social studies time in their day in order to give them, usually it's reading or math intervention. That is, we don't want to pull kids out of science and social studies in order to do intervention in math or literacy. Why? Because even as those interventions might be helping them, at least in literacy, they might be helping them in some regards, they're also taking away from their literacy achievement because they're not getting those opportunities to develop rich science and social studies knowledge. So we need to avoid pulling out during science and social studies for that reason. Another reason we want to do that is for some of our learners, their excitement about science or their excitement about social studies is what keeps them in school and engaged in school. And so we don't want to miss that opportunity because we're pulling them out to work on something that's difficult for them. Another important implication of what I've been saying is that we need to teach much more of our literacy inside science and social studies. And I want to take just a minute here to talk a little bit about terminology. So the Common Core State Standards, for example, in the title say English Language Arts and Literacy. Some people use those terms synonymously, so they might think, oh wait, what does that mean if we say English Language Arts and Literacy? Typically, we're using the phrase English language arts in our field to refer to the work with literature, phonics instruction often falls under that, creative writing, sort of the parts of the day that are more like what you would expect later on to see in an English class. In contrast, the term literacy is actually meant to capture the reading, writing, and other literacy practices that happen in science, in social studies, in technical subjects, in health, and so on. And so literacy is really that broader term that encompasses really the whole day. So when I say much more of our literacy should be taught in science and social studies, I'm not suggesting that we try to do phonics during science, but I am suggesting that those kinds of literacy skills, the literacy knowledge, literacy practices that really deal with, for example, informational texts or deal with trying to obtain information and construct understandings with and through and along with text, that all needs to happen much more in our science and social studies part of the day. Finally, I think an implication of this work is that we really want to prioritize synergy. We want to think about where are those cases where we can have our cake and eat it too, where we can both get science and social studies put into the curriculum and into the day in meaningful ways, and we can continue to bolster important literacy knowledge and skills. Now, I have a few warnings I'd like to share before I close out. So one warning I want to share is that these days there's a lot being made of content-rich English language arts curricula. And many of these curricula will cite science and social studies standards at times, or make a lot of the science and social studies content that they've incorporated into the units. And that's all fine, but that is no substitute for time in the day devoted to science and social studies. So a content-rich curriculum for English language arts is not a substitute for strong science and social studies curriculum. Why? Well, first of all, these content-rich English language arts curricula are typically written by people in English language arts and literacy. They're typically not written by people who are researchers or other experts in elementary science or in elementary social studies. We need the experts and the researchers who do their research every day on science and social studies to be the ones who are driving the bus in terms of the teaching and learning that occurs in science and social studies. For example, there's lots of research in science on young children's scientific misconceptions and at what ages and at what points they have different kinds of misconceptions and how those can be addressed instructionally. Well, that kind of research is not getting reflected in a typical content-rich English language arts curriculum. So we can't have that substitute. A second reason that I'm saying we shouldn't make that substitution is that these content-rich English language arts curricula are often missing really core science and social studies information. Sometimes whole disciplines are missing from the English language arts curricula that claim to be content-rich. So for example, in social studies at the elementary level, we often talk about 4 disciplines. We talk about economics, geography, history, and civics and government. And very often when you look at these content-rich curricula, you'll see, oh, there is quite a bit of history, although not always standards align, but you'll often see much less economics and perhaps little to no geography, and sometimes no civics and government. So we can't afford really to build our science and social studies curriculum based solely on what appears in these English language arts, or even primarily on what appears in these content-rich English language arts curricula. And finally, it's important to note that a lot of times the English language arts curricula that claim to be content-rich, and perhaps are content-rich in some ways, are actually not teaching important science and social studies processes. So for example, good science education includes lots of hands-on investigation, and that's often missing from these English language arts curricula. Good social studies education is often going to work on things like, for example, interviewing and collecting oral history, and that's not something that we would see in these English language arts curricula anyway. So this is not to say avoid having content-rich English language arts curricula. It's to say avoid having that substitute in any way for the important science and social studies education that we need to be providing on its own merits. A second warning I want to make is that I don't want to imply that building knowledge in science and social studies is the answer to our literacy difficulties in the US. It seems like it's so popular for people to say they found the hidden secret or the secret answer or the next new answer to our literacy woes. And lately, phonics continues to be one of the answers that people present, and another of the answers that people present these days is knowledge building. Well, knowledge building and phonics instruction are both really important to high quality literacy education and to improving literacy outcomes in the United States, but they're not the only things. There are many instructional foci that are worthy of our curricular attention based on the research that we have to date. There's not one simple solution here. So yes, I'm an advocate for knowledge building, and no, I don't think knowledge building is a panacea for us. I also want to really make a plea that when we exalt the importance of knowledge, as I'm doing here, it doesn't need to mean that we're demeaning other aspects of the literacy curriculum. I'm hearing lots of people saying, oh, knowledge building is good, comprehension strategy instruction is bad. That's just not where the research is. There's lots of research to support certain kinds of comprehension strategy instruction. You don't have to say comprehension strategy instruction is bad to say that knowledge building is good. Similarly, I'm seeing lots of places neglect text structure instruction despite lots of research on the importance and efficacy of text structure instruction because they're saying, no, we're working on knowledge building. These are not either ors. So maybe a healthcare analogy might be helpful. If we're saying that Americans need to get more sleep, it doesn't mean we're saying that it's not important that they reduce stress or have a good diet or exercise, or if we're saying Americans need to exercise more, we're not saying they don't need to worry about their diet, right? We're perfectly comfortable with the idea that many different features of one's life lead to a healthy lifestyle. Well, similarly, many different components work together to provide a high-quality literacy education. My third warning is that poor quality science and social studies education is probably not going to do a lot for us, right? You know, we want to build this knowledge and skills, but we only can do it when we provide very high quality instruction. So it's not like we can, you know, put just any old science and social studies materials in there and it's going to do the work we want it to do for either science and social studies or for literacy development and achievement. So making sure that we have really high quality materials. What does that mean? Well, one thing it certainly means is that we look at the research that we have in science and social studies education and use that research to build our curriculum materials. It means we have high quality curriculum materials in these areas, but as importantly, probably more importantly, that we have strong professional development in science and social studies so that we have the knowledge, the background, the understanding of these domains that allow for high quality implementation of the curriculum materials that we have. So as a summary, I just want to say that I am a literacy educator. My focus is on improving literacy birth to age 8 so that students move into the upper elementary schools and beyond with very strong literacy skills. And even as someone who focuses on that, perhaps especially as someone who focuses on that, I'm calling for the field to speak up for science and social studies. Thank you for your time.